Hey, everybody. Welcome to this episode of Christian², where eggheads come together and talk. Actually, it's where pastors get to have a conversation with professors, or church gets to interact with academia. Tonight, we are very blessed to have with us Dr. Josef Sykora from Northeastern Seminary. Dr. Sykora serves as the associate professor of biblical interpretation at Northeastern Seminary in Rochester, or as we call it, Rochester, New York. Dr. Sykora, welcome to our program. How does someone who was born in Czechoslovakia become a theologian and end up here in the United States?
Thank you for having me. That's a good question. I'm wondering about it myself most days. I come from the Czech Republic, but I also lived in Slovakia. So Czechoslovakia is actually a good term because I feel I am part of both states or nations. I grew up in a family that was not Christian family. It was a very loving and supportive family, but had a very nominal connection with the Christian faith. So when I was growing up, it felt to me that there is no God out there at all until I was I was a teenager, and with a group of my friends, we befriended two individuals who thought and acted quite uniquely. And they were believers. So we started to argue with them. And that was a first step towards me becoming a Christian. And from there, it took a long time to become a professor. But it's a first step. I can say more too, but this is a good start.
Yeah, so the weird acting people were the Christians, I presume.
Yeah. Yeah.
So was there any
good
were there
way.
any like watershed moment where you felt God really drawing you into the profession or the vocation that you're currently in?
After I became a Christian, I became a part of a campus ministry in the Czech Republic. And I received wonderful foundations in the Christian faith there, and also could participate in several workshops with invited speakers from abroad. And once I was invited to go to a week-long training session in the Bible. And a professor of the Old Testament from Canada came, and he just made the Bible feel very interesting. Suddenly I felt there's much more in the Bible that I had anticipated before. And I fell in love with the Bible, and I think I've been under the Bible's spell since then.
Oh, that's incredible. So hearing that person open up that word of God made you want to say, I'd like to do that same thing someday.
Yeah, that was just like that.
Well, awesome. I always think it's really important for anybody who's going to be taught by somebody or to read them to get an understanding of who they are and what they're like. So we appreciate that. I'm sure our listeners appreciate hearing kind of what's on your heart and kind of where you've come from. I'm going to hand it over to my co-host, Christian Fahey, and we'd like to talk to you a little bit about some of the work that you've done as you've been pursuing this career in biblical interpretation and theology. So, Chris, take it away.
And Joseph, when we talked a week ago, we talked about a number of different directions in which we could go for discussion, but we've kind of narrowed it down as we've spoken over the last week to talking about the idea of the other, and specifically the other as you see in the narratives of Genesis, Jacob and Esau, Cain and Abel. Can you speak to us and tell us when you've done your work in the Old Testament, especially Genesis, what this idea of the other means to you, and kind of segue into the idea of election and chosenness and not being chosen, and what does that mean, and is it different than how many of us in the West have been thinking about elections since the days of the Reformation?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you. It's a great question, Christian. So I got into this by being interested in the topic of religious violence. Initially, I was interested in studying warfare as it is portrayed in the Bible. But then I felt that there is even a step before that, before actual battle, there is a hatred or enmity towards the other.
Mhm.
So I started to be interested in the topic of Israel's election, that is probably most essentially defined in the book of Deuteronomy. But there are, again, even steps there before that definition of election in the book of Deuteronomy. And that brought me to the book of Genesis, following on very important works of other scholars, John Levinson, for example, who sees the strifes between brothers in the book of Genesis
Mhm.
as saying something fundamental about the topic of election, about the one who is chosen or favored by God, and the one who is not chosen or not favored by God. So Cain and Abel is, I think, a good example, and we get it very early in the book of Genesis, that we have a story of Cain and Abel. They both bring offerings to the Lord, but Abel's offering is accepted by
Mhm.
the Lord, but Cain's offering is not accepted. And I think within the Old Testament, or within the book of Genesis, in the Hebrew text, I think the best interpretation is that there is no conceptual quality difference between the two offerings. That it is simply God's choice or favor towards Abel and rejection of Cain. And that is a fundamental twist that begins the storyline of different brothers who are then fighting with each other and struggling with the concept of election.
If you don't mind, are you saying when you're talking about there wasn't fundamentally anything different conceptually in the two offerings? I mean, there were different types of offerings. One was from the ground, the other one was from the flocks. Are you saying that this idea of one being accepted and the other one was rejected, something that was what we would say would be purely arbitrary, or was there more to it? Was there something in the heart of the offerers?
Mm-hmm. Great. So this is, of course, debated, and different texts look at it differently. So the New Testament view of what the difference was is slightly different than I think what the Old Testament presents. But I think within the Old Testament frame of reference, within the book of Genesis, I do not see a significant difference between the two offerings. That is, the choice is purely on God's side.
Okay.
Because both are bringing gifts from the areas in which they're working. They are both bringing from their own work. So one is bringing from the ground and one is bringing sheep, but there doesn't seem to be a big difference between the two. We could say on one hand, then maybe Abel is bringing a more precious offering, but also on the other hand, we could say Cain is offering first. So Abel is just following what Cain did. And I think that difference is actually in God's choice that is hidden from us.
Okay, like Deuteronomy 29, the hidden things belong to the Lord. Something like that?
Mm-hmm. Could be.
Okay,
Yeah.
following on that, typically, and I know when Christian and I were first being prepared for the pastorate in a ministerial college, we were taught, as a lot of people, at least here in the West, were taught, that there was some sort of unwritten revelation of the appropriate kind of sacrifice to offer God, predating the offerings of Cain and Abel. In your view, does that seem to be reading into the text?
That's again a very good point. I do think that I think in some places, before the law is given, the narrative presupposes the law that will be given later.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure that it is playing, that this is playing an important role here.
Okay.
So I think what is on my reading, it's actually not my reading at all, but the reading that I follow and that leads to what I'm doing, how I'm understanding the topic of election in the Old Testament. Here we have a difference between the two people. The world is not equal. God chooses one and doesn't choose the other.
Mhm.
And the main issue is not seeking the reason for that choice, but living appropriately in the world that is not even, that is not just.
Mhm.
So Cain's challenge is to live well with not being chosen,
Within his unchosenness.
within his unchosenness. That is handling that beast that is crouching by his door, that is anger, resentment towards the chosen sibling, that Cain does not handle. And then it leads to the killing of Abel. And we need to therefore read further into other stories in the book of Genesis, for example, Jacob and Esau, to see how that strife can be played out differently.
Okay, this is going to lead into anybody who watches this discussion. It's going to lead into the book of Malachi, but especially the book of Romans. When you talk about chosenness and not chosenness, in the famous passage that says, the children having not done good nor evil, but that the purposes of God according to election should stand. It was written, the elder shall serve the younger. Jacob have I loved, Esau have I hated. As you read Genesis in the light of that statement of Paul's in Romans 9, what is he saying then?
What is Paul saying?
What is Paul saying when he's talking about loving and hating? Is he talking about nations of people? I've read that some people do that. Calvin thought something quite different, as you know.
Okay. I cannot tell you what Paul was thinking. I don't know if anybody can, but definitely somebody who is an expert on the book of Romans can speak more fluently about that. But I can say something, I think, because you touched on the important piece from Malachi that is then repeated in the book of Romans about love towards Jacob and Esau I hated. So Jacob I loved and Esau I hated.
Mhm.
But one way of answering it or looking at it might be to consider another tricky, harsh saying in the Bible that comes from the Gospels.
Mhm.
In the Gospels, for example, in Luke, I have it here in front of me. In Luke 14, Jesus says, "Whoever comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even life itself, cannot be my disciple." So whoever does not hate father and mother. So my question to you would be, shall we hate our parents if we are Christians?
No, the way that I've heard that explained over the last 4 decades of walking as a Christian is that what Jesus is, he's not saying have animosity or ill will toward your parents, obviously, or toward your wife or to your brothers and sisters, but it's the idea that your love for God and your commitment to God is going to be so great that it will seem like hatred in comparison, even though there's no ill will, there's no malice, there's no vengeance, anything like that. Is this possibly what's going on all the way back to the two brothers?
That's how I understand that. I think the language of love and hatred in some passages is simply a language of preference, of favor. Here, your preference for God should be higher than your preference or choice or commitment to your parents or even to your life itself here in Luke. And I think this is what is happening in the choice of Jacob. The choice of Jacob, or love for Jacob, is the choice for Jacob that could feel like hatred towards Esau.
Because
But
he
it's
was
not
not chosen.
right, but it's not an enmity. It's not, there's no encouragement of ill feelings actually towards Esau.
Mhm.
But there is a difference. even before they were born, and therefore we go back to God's choice. Even before they were born, there was a preference for the younger. And that's another important thread through the book of Genesis, that the late born is favored over the firstborn. The firstborn that should actually receive the preference and should receive more honor is not receiving it, but the younger born is.
If I could ask, I don't want to get out of the ring of this fight yet, because this is an incredibly interesting conversation. I wasn't expecting it to go this way, but how does that apply when we deal with like Ishmael and Isaac?
It's a similar phenomenon, I think, that Isaac, as the late born, is the bearer of the promise and the participant in the chosen line.
And you see in that relationship of Ishmael and Isaac a dislike, obvious. How should then, if we, how should the chosen treat or respond to the unchosen?
It's an excellent question.
Because we obviously see there's a problem between Ishmael and Isaac today. How does then, when we're looking at how Cain responded to Abel, how should have Abel responded to Cain, or Israel or Isaac respond to Ishmael? I'm just throwing that out there.
I'll probably stay, for the sake of narratival space, with Jacob and Esau, and then we can return to Isaac and Ishmael, if that's okay.
Yeah,
and
fine.
I would preface the question, how shall the chosen behave towards the unchosen? I would say maybe we need to look at the unchosen's relationship to the chosen first.
Which you talked about last Thursday when we talked. You talked about we could learn something from Esau.
I think so, because he is the one who is not favored, but deals with a very deceiving character, Jacob. Jacob uses several tricks to steal the birthright from Esau, and he succeeds in it. So he receives the blessing from his father, and then when Esau comes, it's too late, and he says, "Father, do you have only one blessing?" Then we learn that the father does not have only one blessing, but the blessing that Esau receives is inferior, because he is told he will have live from the fatness of the earth, but will live with the sword, and you will serve your brother, but when you break loose, you shall break his yoke from your neck. So there is an enmity there and servitude on the part of Esau that is given to him. He will also have something, but he has less. Of course, he's very angry, and similarly to Cain, he is full of hatred. He hates his brother, and he wants to kill him. Jacob runs away, and he's gone for a long time, and eventually comes back, and Jacob is afraid because he is about to meet his brother, who was furious with him in the past. So he's trying to appease him with gifts. And then when he hears that Esau comes with a large company of people, he even divides his family and servants into different groups, again, so that he can appease the brother, and some of them can run away if they're attacked. But when they meet, that's a very interesting piece when they meet. Let me find it. When they meet, it is chapter 33 of Genesis. It says in verse 3, Jacob went on ahead of all of them, bowing down to the ground 7 times until he came to his brother. So we have already a surprising twist here, because Esau is the one who should be inferior, who is a servant. But now Jacob is bowing down 7 times. Esau ran to meet him and embraced him and fell on his neck and kissed him.
Yes.
So he was supposed to break loose from his neck, that yoke, but he didn't. The neck is mentioned again here, an unusual word in those narratives, but in a positive way, not as an image of yoke, but a sign of embrace.
It reminds of the prodigal son.
Yes, exactly. It is. There's actually one book out there that says the prodigal son is modeled after the story of Esau. So Esau
It's
and
fascinating.
Jacob, that they are the two brothers. And eventually Jacob offers the gifts.
That's pretty wild stuff right there. I've never seen that before like that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And one more thing, that Jacob is offering all these gifts to Esau, and Esau says, I have enough, my brother. So he doesn't need anything. We do not know what is happening in the background, but we do see a glimpse of Esau being able to tame that beast of unchosenness that is crouching by the door, so that he has enough. He's not acting with enmity, and Jacob is actually bowing down to him. So we see that this blessing or a prophecy could be fulfilled in a different way. And that's, I think, what we need to pay attention to.
Yeah, he emerges from the whole thing as a big-hearted guy. He's the bigger guy in the room. In
this narrative, he is, yeah.
Okay, now I have a question, kind of following on that, and maybe it has to do with the ways in which people not just read the story of Jacob and Esau, and the way in which they're used later in the prophets and then in the mouth of Paul, but there's a tendency, I think, with Christians here, at least in the United States, especially if you come from a more fundamentalist background, to immediately go to extremes when it says, Jacob have I loved, Esau have I hated, to go to, eternal separations of all sorts of things. And and I'm getting the sense from your work that that's not what you're seeing here, that they may be closer. They may be, number one, they may be closer to one another in the story, remaining God's covenant people in the story. But number two, that the tendency to read extremes in how God looks at them is wrong. Dr. Livermore, who you know, and who taught Christian and I when we were both in seminary, once he did his doctorate in Second Temple Judaism. And he once told us, he says, there's a difference in the way in which Christians, he meant evangelicals and fundamentalists, and Jews think. The Christian says, this is what I believe, and if you don't believe it, you're going to hell. He says, the Jew says, this is what I believe, and if you don't believe it, you're stupid. Is it a case of stupid interpretation to go to such extremes when they read these passages where it talks about the enmity, or Jacob have I loved and Esau have I hated?
I think that a helpful way to understand the topic of election as it is displayed in the Old Testament, how to understand it today, is to see in it advantages and disadvantages in life with which we struggle. So the differences, the inequality of life, and how to handle our privileges, our chosenness, because that's a big task as well, and how to handle our marginalization, that those are things that I see as coming out from the biblical text more clearly than going to the extreme theological positions.
I think it's also huge to for an American, a Westerner who lives in a democracy where we're judged by what we do, and we think we're serving a republic or a democratic God, where really we're serving a God whose favor is what's important or looked after. It's not. It's hard for us, I think, as Westerners in this kind of culture to wrap our mind around that there's God has, do we say favorites? I mean, does God? Yeah. And that's hard for us to relinquish, basically our stance that we're all equal. We're all, so we immediately go to the knee jerk that Cain must have done something wrong. There must have been something inferior in his offering.
Yep. I completely agree with you, Chris. This is well said. I think that the tendency to explain it somehow has been always there, but maybe it is there even more now.
How has this worked, if you don't mind my asking? As you read these stories in Genesis about the other, because there's an awful lot of marginalization all over the world, certainly in our land, and the marginalized will let you know that they don't appreciate being marginalized. How, in some practical way, has this informed the way in which you relate to people, or how you teach your students, saying, look, there's something that we can apply here in 21st century America or 21st century Eastern Europe that we can get from these stories dealing with the other?
We haven't finished talking about the brotherly strifes in the book of Genesis, but we do not need to go there. However, I do want to say that we do not know much about Esau. He is in the background when Jacob is gone. Then we see some change in him. We also need to be realistic, and the Bible is realistic. Their ending is not like a complete harmonious living together. They do live separately. And the Bible, I think, is quite realistic about this. Biblical characters are not black or white. They are just like us. We struggle with both. But the culmination of this struggle is in the story of Joseph and his brothers. When we get a better look or deeper look on the chosen, that's Joseph, and also the unchosen and the prime unchosen among them, and that's Judah. And if we want to, we can go there and talk there, because that's actually where my work or the book begins.
Please do, because I do reading it. One would think it would be Reuben because he was the firstborn. Explain why, in your view, Judah represents the unchosen better.
Well, that is an excellent question, and I do not have a great answer. The story is giving only 2 or 3 glimpses of why Reuben is kind of left out. And he definitely has noble intentions in the story. He wants to save Joseph, for example.
True.
He even says to his father, you can have my 2 sons if I don't bring Benjamin back. It's all noble intentions. But he doesn't seem to grasp what the time requires, or how to transfer noble intentions into prudent action. Judah is a practical man. He is prudent. He has terrible ideas, or very immoral ideas. He wants to sell his younger brother and gain some money from it. So he wants to have some profit.
Yes.
He wants to have something from it. But then he is able somehow to intuit what should be said when. So he's a practical man. But the book, the Joseph story, the Joseph cycle, Genesis 37 to 50, has an interesting thing there that did not appear before. Before, we always had a focus on the chosen character and also some reactions towards the unchosen or the unfavored one. But here, I think for the first time, in one chapter, that's chapter 38, we spend only time with Judah, and Joseph is nowhere around. And that gives us some kind of glimpse or idea what is happening with the chosen and how the chosen can change. So what was not visible in the story of Esau is visible in the story of Judah, that he has family troubles. He has sons who are dying. And then the last one, the youngest, is in danger. And therefore he doesn't want to give it to Tamar. He wants to hold on to it. It's the only son whom he has. But then Tamar tricks him, and I think shows him that he needs to risk the life of his son, or he needs to risk something in order to gain for the future. And therefore, then he's able to say to his father, no, you need to let Benjamin go to Egypt, even though you might lose him, because the future of our clan depends on it. And then because of that, he's able to stand and take Benjamin's place when Joseph wants to put Benjamin in the prison, presumably to see if the brothers have changed or not in the meantime. And he's willing to say, no, I'm going to go. He is the chosen one, Joseph. And he, in the place of Joseph, Benjamin is the chosen one. So Jacob left Joseph, and when Joseph disappeared, the other brothers were not substituted for Joseph. It was love for Benjamin. So he had his favorites. It's again the story of favorites that is seen in the behavior of the parents. But in this culmination of the favoritism in the book, Judah is able to say, no, I'm going to be in prison, in slavery, for my chosen brother, even though I'm not going to have anything from it. And I think he learned in that story with Tamar what life requires, that there needs to be some kind of risking our life. Maybe I can spell it better later.
Okay, so he emerges like Esau did as magnanimous, big-hearted.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, he does.
Fascinating. Thank you for blowing our minds tonight, Dr. Sykora. We really appreciate that. Before we wrap up here, we just have a few questions we want to ask you. I'm going to ask you a question that's very personal to me. If you had a choice between thin crust New York pizza or Chicago pizza, what would you choose?
Yeah, Chris, I do not even know the difference. I do not eat pizza unless I make it for myself. So Sykora pizza.
All right, well,
that's my choice.
What is it?
Sykora pizza. It's a pizza that I make.
Okay. All right. Well, don't ever eat pizza that comes out of a crock pot. That is Chicago style pizza. It's more of a soup inside of a crust. New York pizza is very, very thin, kind of like on matzah. Yeah, so like I'm a big proponent
Deep
for
dishes like this, Joe.
Okay. Well, you've told me something.
Like a pie. Yeah.
You've told me
now,
something.
Chris has a question. He'd like to ask you about some song or something like that.
Tell me what the song, the Scorpion song, Wind of Change, means to you as an Eastern European.
Interesting. I have it connected with the change that took place in Eastern Europe in 1989. That is the fall of communism and the sudden change that made the world a different place, which was a wonderful time through which I lived. I don't know if that's the connection that you have, but that's actually the connection that I have in my mind.
For us, it I hate to say it, but it'd be a more academic connection because we didn't live there. You and your family, your loved ones knew what it was like to live behind the Iron Curtain, and so I thought I'd ask about that. All right, two groups. I got to get your views, and maybe these are not your groups, but if you had to choose between the Beatles or U2, who would you choose?
I'll choose U2.
Okay.
All right, one more question before we wrap up. If you had 5 books you feel every pastor today should either read or have on their shelf, what could you give us on that? It doesn't have to be 5. Give us 3, whatever you think.
I do not feel equipped to advise pastors on all things that they need to know. And therefore, I'll stay to my topic that I've been asked so far, and that is the topic of the chosenness in the Bible. I would definitely recommend the work of my supervisor for Ph.D., Walter Mulberly. And he wrote a very thin book called Theology of the Book of Genesis, in which he doesn't deal with all things in the book of Genesis, but very helpfully looks at some key stories and connects them with the needs and questions of today. So it's not a dry theology, but connects with larger questions that we deal with. Then the second book that I would mention or author is John Levinson. It's a Jewish scholar, and his Death and the Resurrection of the Beloved Son is a very beautiful book. It sounds like a Christian title, doesn't it? Death and the Resurrection of the Beloved Son. His point is that these stories in Genesis and beyond describe metaphorical deaths of the chosen, and therefore they create a paradigm that is then later taken up in the New Testament. So we have a metaphorical, symbolical death of Abel, and Jacob and Joseph. And that's a paradigm that is already present in the Old Testament. It's not something that comes up only in the New Testament. And finally, I have one more that could be, I think, for those who would like to get a quicker entry into the topic of the other. It's a book written by Frank Anthony Spina called The Faith of the Outsider. It's a nice book that looks at different Old Testament and New Testament stories about those who are outside of Israel and outside of the church, who are demonstrating faith that actually we should have.
Very good.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Dr.
Yes,
Sykora, for coming on the program
anytime.
today with us. And want to say we'll make all those resources available on our Facebook page. There'll be links where you could pick those up if you like them, and we'll list them there. I want to remind everybody that Christian² is sponsored by New Life CNY, the most exciting church in Central New York. Just kidding. I'm the pastor. But anyway, we want to thank Dr. Sykora and thank everybody for tuning on in. Hopefully we can get him back on the show in the next number of weeks. Thanks again. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.